Beauty is universal and fundamental, and ultimately, like you said, not subjective. There's a reason why many ancient cultures, when they were building their temples and all these beautiful buildings, always kind of turned towards the same or similar systems of proportion when building their buildings, because they were universal. In terms of sustainability, I think it's quite simple. If something is beautiful, then people are attached to it and they wouldn't want to knock it down. They'll value it and they'll care for it. So Peter, my partner, he named his thesis Project Environmental Imagination. And he was arguing in his thesis that it's useless designing the most energy efficient and environmentally friendly buildings if ultimately people don't like them, and won't want to inhabit them. So make buildings beautiful, combine beauty with environmental requirements, and you get sustainable and long-lasting buildings.
As you know, I have a very clear mission with building green. And I know so many brilliant architects, interior designers, and contractors who do too. But they're still stuck working on projects that drain them, with clients who don't value what they bring. That's why we founded Market Your Architecture a year ago. It's a marketing agency that helps mission-driven designers attract better clients, charge what they are worth, and finally build the kind of portfolio that reflects who they really are. If that sounds like the shift you need, there's a link in the description to marketyourarchitecture.com. And before we jump into the podcast, please rate and subscribe. It really helps me reach more people like you. In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina Schipf, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. If you're an architect trying to build a practice with really strong values, listen up. Because it's so important to learn how to say no to the wrong projects, to keep pushing for your ideas, even after several rounds of no from your clients or the city, and to really build a reputation that attracts the kind of clients that are aligned with your values. Sandro Valentino from Valentino Architects shows you how to do exactly that. And he also talks about how sometimes a small team is exactly what allows you to pursue that bigger mission. He shares some super interesting stories from how he retrofitted an old animal shelter into an award-winning home, to reusing demolition stone for a facade. And yes, he had to combine stone from 2 different building sites, to designing dementia care homes that really shifted negative public perception and strengthened community alive. And even if you're just here for a few good stories told by a really passionate architect, this conversation will really leave you inspired by how thoughtful design can have an impact on the environment. Thank you so much, Sandro, for joining me today. I'm super excited to talk with you about beautiful, sustainable architecture, especially in Malta. But before we start and talk about your projects, can you give me a bit of context about you? How did you get where you are today? And what was the mission you had in mind when you first founded your architectural practice, Valentino Architects?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Valentino Architects is an architecture studio based in Valletta, Malta. We set up about 10 years ago in March of 2015, and it was set up by myself and my cousin Peter, who is also an architect. Our team consists of 6 architects, so we're a small team, and we intend to keep it that way, but it doesn't mean that our ambitions are small. So we work on projects of various sizes. And finally, after 10 years of working, some of the larger projects and the more complex ones are finally getting off the ground. So it's quite an interesting time at the moment here at the office. So we work in a context in Malta where there's a large existing building stock, a lot of which has a lot of architecture and historical significance. So most of our work involves the rehabilitation, adaptation, and sometimes extensions of old and historical buildings. So we are privileged sometimes to work on buildings quite often which are 300 or 400 years old. So it's quite interesting, discovering the layers of history which these buildings contain. I mean, in fact, I'm speaking to you at the moment from our studio in Valletta, which is a building which is about 450 years old. The walls are about a meter and a half thick, and it actually used to be a building which belonged to the Knights of Malta. It used to be part of the Auberge de France. So historically, it's quite a significant building. In fact, once we applied for a permit to open a new window in our facade, and it was refused. So
Crazy. Can you give me a bit of context about the history of Malta? Because it is a very special place.
yeah, sure. Malta is a very small island, right? So it's at the center of the Mediterranean, and it's only 27 kilometers long by 14 kilometers wide. So it's very small, and it's an independent country. It's a new member state, and it's one of the most southernmost parts of Europe. And it's also a bit of a melting pot of all the cultures which exist around the Mediterranean. Right, so our language is a mix of Semitic and Romantic languages. It's the only Semitic language in the EU, and it's the only Semitic language written in using the Latin alphabet. And the people here, so it's influenced by Arabic, Italian, Sicilian, French, and it's a mix of all these languages. In fact, our numbers sound totally Arabic, so we say wieħed, tnejn, tlieta, erba. And the people here are very much a reflection of this, and so is the architecture. So you find balconies, we call them Maltese balconies, but these balconies which resemble North African mushrabiyas. You find palatial buildings which you'd expect to see in Rome or in France. You find vernacular agricultural buildings which you'd expect to see in the Maghreb. You find row houses which seem to be very British. So it's very much a mix of all the cultures and all the people who have ruled Malta in its past. So from the Phoenicians, the Romans, the Arabs, the Normans, the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, who were here for over 250 years, they were a bit of an aristocratic class, who came to Malta from all over Europe, and they left a huge built legacy here in Malta. One such as the city of Valletta, which I'm in right now, which was built by Jean de la Valette, was one of the Grand Masters of the Order. The French were also here. Napoleon was here for 6 days. So Malta was under French occupation for 2 years. It was very brief. But Napoleon, when he came to Malta, it's said that he was incredibly impressed by all the fortifications around the Grand Harbour. He said it's one of the most fortified places he's ever seen, and that's quite something coming from someone like Napoleon. And the British were also here for over 150 years, so we gained our independence in the 1960s. So all these people who are here in Malta had a huge influence on our language, our culture, and our buildings. And Malta's history is actually much older than that. So apart from all these people who are here, there were also more ancient people who built temple-like structures, which are said to be the oldest freestanding structures in the world here in Malta. Temples like Im Naidra and Hajar Im. Hajar means stone in Arabic. And the underground hypogeum, which is this hand-carved temple, which we know very little about. So the context and the history here is extremely rich, and it's hard to get away from. So we work, and being very small and very densely populated, we're surrounded by these things all the time. You can't really get away from them here, which is a good thing.
I'm so fascinated about how many influences, cultural and architectural influences there are from what we've talked about before about Malta. And before we talk about your project specifically and how you keep them sustainable, I would love to hear from you how you built such a strong brand. I told you before, I'm really fascinated by your architecture, how you take old elements and give them this new aesthetic, and you have a really strong architectural language. I really encourage everybody listening to check out your website and your projects. You really have very clear lines, historic textures, elements with modern touches. It kind of feels to me obvious, but on the other hand, very unexpected with the colors and the modern touches you give them. So my question is, in a world that moves so fast, and in also Malta, we talked about it before, Malta is developing really fast. How would you recommend somebody, or how did you build such a strong brand, or how do you actually say no to the wrong projects?
Yeah, I mean, although we've been open for 10 years now as an office, practicing for 10 years, I still feel like we're at the beginning of our career here at the studio. It's good. It's nice to hear all these nice things about our work. So it gives us a lot of courage. But I think we try to stick to our. So we like to say at the office that we don't only have a paying client. We also have we try to we try to kind of say that we've got three clients, right? We've got the paying client who gives us the project and who delivers a brief. But we also try to design for society, so for social requirements, even when it's maybe not specifically a client request. So I'll give you two examples of projects we're working on at the moment. So we were asked to design a proposal for the conversion and adaptation of a storage warehouse into a residential building for a repeat client who's given us a lot of work. And we ended up proposing 32 apartments in this project on a site where he could actually build up to 45 apartments. So we proposed 32 1, 2, and 3 bedroom apartments instead of 45. And in the rest of the space, we created public open spaces. We connected these two streets from side to side. We created like the shaded piazza, open spaces between the apartments, shared terraces, shared facilities, and all this. And most developers here in Malta would laugh at you, if you propose something like that, because they would want their 45 three-bedroom apartments. But this client has a vision, and he believes in what we're all doing together. So he said yes. So it's a project which we're going to start developing and hopefully apply for a building permit soon. So there's the paying client, the social client, and society at large on different scales. And I'll give you another example actually of something similar with another project we're developing. So we're on a similar scale. So we've been working on this care home for the elderly, which is specifically designed for people with dementia. And it's located on the periphery of a historical village called Zabuch, which means olive in Maltese. And we've been developing it with a colleague of mine named Alexia Mercia, who specializes in design for people with dementia. So in this building, apart from the building itself being a social need, because there's a huge need for this type of building all over the world, and also here in Malta. We also designed the building with key design elements which are designed specifically for the end user, right, for people with dementia. But we also opened up the ground floor of the building to the public. So the ground floor will be a public space which is a bit of a threshold, on the boundary between the village and this village within a village for people with dementia, which we're trying to create. In Malta, society is very close knit, so people look after each other. The positioning of this building within the village really makes sense for this type of building, and it could really be a space where even the stigma, sometimes associated with care homes for the elderly, and the perception which even kids have of these types of places, it's really a place where which we're hoping could change maybe this negative perception that might exist. So the building is being built by a developer. It's being done ultimately to make a profit. But that doesn't rule out other social goals which you could achieve. In fact, on a related subject, Peter, my cousin, is currently on a sabbatical. He's in Sweden for a year. And he was talking to me about Sweden's right of public access. So apparently there's this principle in Sweden, which is reflected in a number of Swedish laws, which allows the public to access and enjoy nature on what is mostly privately owned land. So people are allowed pretty much to move freely within privately owned land, which is quite an interesting concept, which doesn't really exist here. People have their parcel of land and they usually like to erect high walls between their properties. And in fact, this was also an idea which we tried to explore a couple of years ago, when we were asked to propose a project for new houses on a huge plot of land, which was about 40,000 square meters big. And our idea was to raise all the dwellings on stilts to give people kind of privacy and security. And instead of building walls between the different parcels of land, just planting vegetation around these kind of houses on stilts, allowing people, but more importantly, even animals, rainfall, waterways, and all this stuff to kind of flow freely below and around the houses. Which brings us to the third client, which is the environment. So we always try to propose solutions which kind of prioritize retrofitting, adaptive reuse of buildings over demolition, prioritizing passive environmental design, just like our ancestors used to do with the vernacular, prioritizing traditional building materials and building techniques. So those are the values which we kind of try to stick to. And we do say no to certain things, but more than saying no, I think if you kind of build a bit of a concept of what you want to do and you start doing it, then automatically the work you want to attract comes your way. The rest is just the noise doesn't, so thankfully, and I'm very grateful to say so, we've been quite lucky with the work people approach us to do. And this is also related to us wanting to keep our office small, because if we keep our office small, we can produce work of quality, and we don't need to take on a tremendous amount of projects in order for the books to balance at the end of the year, if you know what I mean. So
I think that's a very good advice. Now, you mentioned 3 projects. In those cases, did it more come from your side to have to think about the bigger social impact that you had? And did you have to sell that idea to the developer, or was that an idea that came from him?
In the case of the first project, the first 2 projects I spoke about are happening. The last project has kind of been put on hold. The house is on stills project, but the first 2 projects are happening. The idea in the first case, so the apartment building, this is the 4th project we're developing with this specific client. So after 3 projects, we've kind of gotten used to each other. So maybe he knew what to expect when he asked us to develop this project, but he pretty much gave us an open brief. They've got this warehouse building which belonged to his family because they use it for warehousing of bathrooms to store bathroom items. And he just told us, listen, I want to develop this into a residential building. Let me, like, in your hands, tell me what could come out of it. So we proposed this idea. He also kind of worked out the numbers and he thought it made sense. And even in the case of the Old People's Home project, it was actually quite funny because the client approached us with this project at Christmas time of 2018, I think. So it's been a while. My beard has gone a bit white since then. Um, uh, and he said that him and his partners were buying a piece of land in this village. And he told us he wants to develop it into an old people's home, into a care home. And he wants to target a specific part of the market. So he didn't even specify that it's for people with dementia. So he gave us pretty much a free hand to figure it out, you know. So we had to put the right team together. We had a very short time to do so. I remember we had to submit the planning application by the 1st of June, and we submitted it on the 31st of May. So this idea of the public space in that case also came from us, but I suppose it's not just a part of the project which you could simply extract. You know, it's a core part of the project. So if the developer or the client sees value in the whole, in the bigger picture, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. You know, so he also allowed us to go ahead with the idea. We'll see if it works in a few years' time after it's built.
That is very cool how you manage to, again, bring in your values into a project by working with the right people. So you mentioned before that Malta has a lot of very old, beautiful buildings. Can you walk me through how you approach retrofitting spaces that were designed centuries ago, sometimes
Yeah.
even for animals,
Yeah.
and how you make them functional and beautiful today?
Yes, in fact, as I was saying, I mean the buildings we've inherited are really special and really beautiful, and we're very fortunate to be able to work on these types of buildings. And like you said, a lot of them were not built for habitation; they were built to house animals. Some of them were built to as kind of mill rooms and things like this. So for a lot of agricultural purposes. They are generally, a lot of them are built completely out of stone, especially the kind of poorer buildings which were built for animals, because limestone, this yellow limestone which we have here in Malta, is the only natural resource that we've got here. So there was very little access to timber and other building materials which could be used to create roofing and all this sort of stuff. So somehow with these limitations, people manage to build incredibly beautiful buildings, you know, walls out of stone, arches out of stone, vaults out of stone, which were built for animals. They were built arched or vaulted because they needed big spans. Now these rooms make beautiful living rooms. You know, so now after 300 or 400 years, everyone wants to live in them, and because they really make beautiful buildings. Um, uh, so a lot of now these buildings today are not used to house animals anymore. So a lot of them now have become houses, hotels, guest houses, all sorts of buildings. So functions which are very different to what they were originally intended to be used for, and with today's expectations, client expectations, and very many times with a very exhaustive and demanding brief. You know, for example, if we look at Valletta, a lot of Valletta was built, so the ground was quarried, and a lot of the rock to build the buildings was actually quarried from the ground where they were built. People would build a basement in the empty space, in the void which was created, and then build the house above the basement. But in that case, for example, the basement wouldn't have been built for habitation. It would have been built to ventilate the area beneath the house to try to keep the house dry. Today, people want to use the basements, you know, because today every square meter comes at a certain value. So how do you go about making these spaces habitable? If you like, I can explain our ideas maybe through a couple of projects which we've recently worked on and completed, which are two very similar types of houses actually. One is called Dar el Mitkhna, which means the mill house, and the other one is called Dar San Rocco, we named it Dar San Rocco, so Saint Roque House, because there's this statue of Saint Roque with his sheep looking straight into the house from across the road. It's really really beautiful. And these houses are both located within similar, pretty dense historical urban contexts. And like we were saying, they were previously used to house animals, and one was used as a mill room and to house animals. So you have to imagine that these buildings were built sometimes very beautifully, but also very crudely. So just block on block, very thick walls. The technology at the time wasn't available to plane a block, a stone block from all of its sides. So they used to only plane one side and put it against another block, which is planed from this side against each other. In Maltese, we call that shullil. And they used to fill the cavity with soil and loose material which they found from the site. They used to point the joints with soil as well. They used to use soil as mortar. So these, you can imagine, are structures which are actually quite humid. You know, the stones are just placed on the rock, if you're lucky, because sometimes they're just built on top of loose material or on top of soil. So you need to find ways how to reinforce these foundations and these structures. So although they are very beautiful, they also require a lot of study and a lot of work. So generally, I mean, we approach these buildings. Our approach is always a bit of a combination between traditional techniques, such as, I mean, understanding how the building was actually built and designed to function. So studying kind of passive environmental control systems and how they could be employed within the design. Systems which rely on thermal mass, designing for cross ventilation, installing systems like elevated ventilated floors so that moisture which comes up from the ground doesn't end up ruining your floor, but kind of dries up because there's a ventilated cavity, and it also doesn't divert into the walls, because otherwise your walls would be very humid and you'd start getting mold and stuff like this. And trying to make sure that our clients understand these things. You know, for example, there are a lot of very beautiful courtyard houses here in Malta, and the trend at a point was to roof over the courtyard with glass. So that usually kind of just destroys the way the building is functioning environmentally. So then people start complaining that the walls are humid, that there's moisture. It's obvious because that courtyard was always designed to be the lung of the building. And no matter how
And
many
you suddenly
forced
have a
ventilation.
heater.
And you have a heater, of course. You have a heater and you don't have ventilation, so you've destroyed
Yeah.
the way the house is working. But apart from these design elements, there's also the material aspect. So what materials can you use, you know, to finish the walls? There was a trend at a point here in Malta that a lot of the walls used in these buildings were left in stone. The buildings which were used for animals were generally always were that way, but buildings which were used as houses, the walls generally used to be plastered. They used to be plastered with lime-based materials. People used to mix a lot of pigments into the plaster. The color of the pigment generally indicated how well off the residents were. If you found blue, it means they used cobalt. So to get that blue kind of color, so it meant that they were pretty well off. So we are returning. So, well, we still use these materials today in construction. We plaster old walls using lime-based materials. People need to understand that the lime reacts to the moisture content of the wall. So your wall will end up having this patchy, cloudy kind of look, which some people don't like. But if you don't like it, then you can't live in an old house, you know? So these are things which you need to accept, and which in fact are really beautiful. It's these imperfections which really look beautiful. So we combine these kind of techniques with more technological and advanced systems, such as underfloor heating systems, double glazed apertures and stuff like this, you know. So it's always a combination of these different things to try to achieve the level of comfort which people which people will be able to accept. So these are things we've done in both of these houses. So that's to the old part, but then generally you'd need to extend because a lot of these houses were single-story houses, which wouldn't be big enough to house all the requirements of today's family. So in both cases, we extended on top of the old building, and we did so by using stone. So again, local stone, which is so continuing kind of the materiality and keeping it homogeneous in that sense. But we used certain little details which kind of make you realize obviously that what we've done is new and is contemporary, like little gaps between the old and the new, alternating course heights. So we've changed the heights of the stone courses. So even in 100 or 200 years time, if this building is still there and you look at it, you can tell, that that the building was done at different times. And both buildings also contain these bridges which connect the new extensions which we've built on the roof. One bridge is totally in glass, so it's this reflective glass which was designed to reflect the surrounding village and which at night becomes transparent, so it lights up the courtyard below, which is pretty cool. And the other bridge is onto the street. So it was designed as this colonnade, which allows you from the street to still look straight into the courtyard as you did before the extension was built. So Saint Roque from across the street can pretty much look into the bathroom at the back of the back of the house. And that's actually this extension I'm talking about, this bridge, this colonnaded bridge, took us about 4 years to get a building permit for because the authorities simply wouldn't have it because it looked a bit too different to the surroundings. But we persevered. We pretty much built all of the house around this bridge and we left this gaping hole in the facade until we finally managed to convince them with a bit of compromise about the design of the facade. We built it, and later on in the year, it won this local award for adaptive reuse buildings, which we were quite happy about. So it's
Cool,
important not
congrats.
to, well, not to compromise as much as possible. At least if you can justify or if you really believe in what you're doing.
Oh, that is such a good advice. I think so many architects compromise to please their clients, even like the city standards or something like that,
Yeah,
just to
yeah,
get the project moving forward. That's also why it's
yes,
important to have enough time for a project so that you can
of course.
work on those details. And I wanted to touch on that project where you reused the stone from the demolished building for the
Yes.
facade. Do you think that kind of material circularity could scale, or is that only possible in special contexts like yours?
No, I think it's possible in many different contexts. We try to do it here on different scales. So even in the case of, for example, these two houses, which I was just talking about, we would reuse certain stone blocks while we're carrying out alterations. For example, if we're opening a doorway in that wall and we're closing one in the other one, we'd just shift the blocks from wall to wall, for example. But that's pretty basic. Another project we worked on recently, which we've just completed, is a new small terminal building at the airport here in Malta, which is a project which was led by Peter, by my partner, and he worked on it together with Jan, who's a colleague of mine from the office. So the project was a small terminal building here at the airport, so separate to the main airport. It's like the scale of a house, let's say, this of a large house. And there was an existing building on the site which needed to be taken down and rebuilt. But instead of demolishing it, what they did, and they convinced the client also to do so, was to dismantle the building by hand. So block by block, stone by stone. And you have to imagine the stones are generally about 55 centimeters long by about 26 centimeters high. So they're also extremely heavy. So they convinced the client to dismantle the building by hand, preserve the blocks, and reuse them in the newly constructed building. So what they did was take the block, cut it lengthwise. Peter says like a piece of bread, like you're cutting toast, kind of. They finished then the new faces of the blocks with this kind of rough hammered finish, and they used the blocks to build this self-supporting facade around the new building. But what happened was halfway through the building construction, the contractor realized that they didn't actually have enough stone to rebuild all the facades which they needed to build. So Peter and I then sat down and started discussing where we could get more stone, more recycled stone from. And it happened that the contractor working at the airport was also about to start work on another project of ours, where we also needed to to demolish a house and build a new house in a place called Wardia. And the client of the other project accepted that the contractor would dismantle this house by hand, take the stone to the airport, chop it up, and use it in the facade of this new airport building. So I guess we were lucky that we're working with the same contractor, but kind of the stars aligned, and I think it's pretty cool to say that that we used stone from these two separate projects to rebuild the facade of this really beautiful building, which in fact has now been completed. In fact, Jean was at the airport. My colleague Jean was at the airport with Julian, the photographer, this morning, just taking some photos of the building. So hopefully you'll be able to see it on our website and social media pretty soon. But the truth is that a process like this is actually very expensive. Dismantling, although it seems to make perfect sense, it's not always possible to do so on projects maybe which have a lower budget, because today labor costs are insanely expensive. To demolish a building using an excavator in a few hours is super easy and super cheap, and it's cheaper to just discard and throw away all that material, which is such a waste, especially because the material in the Maltese quarries, the local stone, is finite. Only yesterday, Jean and I were at a local contractor here in Malta, who are developing this reconstituted stone block as a project. I mean, they've been developing it for about 15 years. So they're taking construction waste and producing reconstituted stone blocks out of this construction waste, which is really beautiful. And it's designed to resemble the local stone. And this contractor was telling us that the stone it's very hard to find good quality stone anymore, so how does it make sense that you can just demolish and throw away so much material when the stone is finishing? It's finite. So there really should be government subsidies on stuff like this. On another project we were working on, I remember I asked a contractor to give us a price to dismantle a building by hand so that we can reuse the material, and the price he gave us was about 1.5 times the cost of just building the same amount of walls in new stone. So the maths doesn't make sense, so we don't yet give enough value to this resource, which is so precious and which is so finite.
Just a quick reality check. If you're constantly over-delivering, working around the clock, and still chasing the right kind of projects, you're not alone. I keep meeting architects, interior designers, and contractors in that exact cycle, which is actually why we started Market Your Architecture. We help you reposition your work and get in front of more of the right people, so you can finally choose who you want to work with. If that sounds interesting to you and you want to know more about us, you'll find the link to marketyourarchitecture.com in the description. Before we go into the Malta building standards and the regulations, what do you say to clients who would rather demolish and start fresh because it's cheaper?
I guess it depends on the case, because you do find a lot of a lot of buildings are sometimes a bit of a hybrid, so even historically in the past, a townhouse which would work on renovating now, many times people used to give a lot of importance to the design and the finishes and the proportions of the front side of the house. The back side of the house, many times, would be built in a very utilitarian way, in a way which is not connected to the garden at the back, and so on and so forth. So it is quite common that we would demolish a small, like the back part of a house, to be able to build something more contemporary and more functional, and then retain the front side, or something like that. But we don't often get clients who just say, "Listen, I want to demolish this house if it has value." I mean, there have been projects where we have demolished buildings. I mean, I can't pretend that every single project we do is 100% sustainable, because working in the current economic system, it's very difficult to do so. But when a building has this intrinsic value and quality, generally people do not want to demolish it, if you know what I mean. It's generally buildings which are built to very low standards, which end up being demolished and rebuilt. So we try to convince our clients as much as possible, when there is the idea of demolishing, to reuse, if that makes sense in that particular case.
Yeah, I think it's so important to look at every particular case. What do we have? What are the needs? And educate the client. It's not his responsibility or their
Yeah.
responsibility to have our education. That's where the architect comes in. So let's talk about building standards in Malta and the regulations and the role of regulations. What is one thing that you think is really missing to make Malta more sustainable, especially now that it's booming?
I think a lot of the bill. If we had to speak about planning policy, let's say, rather than regulation, um, it's quite it's quite quantitative, right? Not based on quality. So although the planning authority has tried to develop planning policies and regulations which try to look at quality more than quantity, unfortunately, the process is still very much a bit of a checklist approach. And in Maltese, we have a saying. In Malta's a bit of a country of extremes, right? So you either have, in Maltese we say "jew nejja jew maħruqa," which means it's either raw or it's burnt. There's nothing in between. And this can also be applied to planning policy here. Many times in the historical village cores, we're told no a lot. When you propose a project, even if it's been very well thought out, but if perhaps it has aspects to it in terms of design which are, let's say, not very traditional, then initially you're told no, and you have to keep on trying to justify your design and your arguments until hopefully you manage to get what you want. So they generally, the authorities sometimes go for a bit of a copy paste approach. If you've got a building which looks like this and you want to add a floor to that building, you can add the floor, but you need to make it look identical to the ones below, which is not really something which speaks of its time at all. But again, I think when you persevere and you manage to convince, sometimes you get your way. In fact, we're finishing off this small guest house in the three cities at the moment. The three cities are these three old towns across the Grand Harbour from Valletta, where we built this extension over an old building, in stone, but we built it on this kind of steel truss structure, and we left this gap all around the building. So the stone block seems to be like it's floating above the building below it.
That's so cool.
Which It's pretty cool. The building is almost ready. The guest house hopefully will open around September, or at the beginning of autumn, let's say. But it's not really the norm. I mean, the first reaction we got from the planning authority at that time was, there's a committee called the Design Advisory Committee. They told us, listen, just make it like the floors below, but in that time, it's been a few years now. Probably if we had to apply for this permit today, it would probably get refused because they've become more stringent than they used to be before. And this is within historical areas. But then outside, it's a bit of a free for all. Demolishing buildings all over the place, not historically important ones necessarily, but construction then outside of the village cores is pretty rampant here. There are zoning plans which say in this area you can build 5 floors, in this area you can build 4 floors. So plots which were previously parceled for terraced houses, 6 meters wide, for a little house, which made sense, are now being demolished to be built into 5 floor apartment blocks. So we're ending up with all these massive blank walls, for looking at other properties. It's a bit of a hodgepodge. So, and unfortunately, architects are part of this, are part of the problem. It's a bit of a case of pointing fingers at each other, so I give equal responsibility, let's say, to architects, to planners, and to developers, because architects are signing off these buildings, planners are giving permits for them, and developers are building them. So I think we really need to get together to understand what our ambition and our vision should be for Malta, because space here is finite and it's very small, so you can't really get away from these things, and we just can't afford to make such mistakes, and the environment can't afford us to make these sorts of mistakes either.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like, it's always annoying for creative architects if they are very strict. But if you understand the purpose of them being very strict, for example, I feel like in Switzerland, the permitting process is very strict as well. But I do very much see the point, especially when you walk around another city somewhere, maybe South America, or in a big city where you have all these ventilations at street level. That's something you're not allowed to do in Switzerland. And when you're doing the process, that's the last thing you think about. And then you have to do the ventilation over the roof. You need to find some space where you can hide it and stuff like that. But I do definitely see the point when you walk around in a place like Zurich, you have no ventilation, no bad air in your face. What do you think should be done to, like, it sounds like cities are being or Malta is being very strict, but for the wrong reason. So you kind of start to miss this creativity, which defined Malta's architecture so far, but not necessarily for a better environmental impact.
Yes, I think ultimately it boils down to people building buildings just to make a profit, because a lot of these apartment buildings are being built purely for financial reasons and nothing else, but I think the issue is not planning policy or architects or developers. It's the system which we're accustomed to work within. So if we're going to always prioritize financial gain over everything else, then this is what we're going to get, and there's no way we can stop that. But if we start to question our value system and split it between financial, social, and economic, so if we give these 3 things equal value, then we'll start to get better buildings and a better built environment. So if, for example, subsidies are given not to demolish buildings, or subsidies are given to reuse building material, or subsidies are given to create elevated floors for people to walk underneath. I don't know, I'm just giving silly examples. But if these things are done, then maybe people would stop to try to squeeze every last square inch out of their building sites, which is something which we're ending up with buildings which are not of any quality at all, and people are forced to buy them. People are forced to kind of jump onto the property ladder and buy an apartment which costs $250,000, which is terribly built and terribly designed, but they don't really have an option. They don't really have a choice. I think ultimately the problem is related to what we value. We need to rethink our value system before we can start changing the way things are being done. That's how I feel.
So it goes back to education. Everybody knows the value of money, but we need to talk about the other two values that you mentioned.
Yes. If I can just add one thing here because you're reminding me of something. It's Jean yesterday mentioned, my colleague Jean mentioned a quote by Richard England, who's like the preeminent architect here in Malta, who's been practicing for a very long time. And he likes to say that today people know the price of everything and the value of nothing. So we know the price of dismantling a building by hand, which is very expensive, but we don't really know the value of the block which you're dismantling. It takes us back to what we were talking about before.
And speaking of values, I talk a lot about beauty on this podcast because
Yeah.
I've realized that a lot of people consider beauty to be one of the most sustainable things because you would never tear down a beautiful project. And I'm fascinated by the definition you gave me for beauty. You said beauty isn't subjective. Can you
Yeah.
explain what you mean by that?
Yes, I believe that beauty is universal and fundamental, and ultimately, like you said, not subjective. I mean, there's a reason why many ancient cultures, when they were building their temples and all these beautiful buildings, always kind of turn towards the same or similar systems of proportion when building their buildings. Because they were universal. So in terms of sustainability, I think it's quite simple. If something is beautiful, then people are attached to it and they wouldn't want to knock it down. They'll value it and they'll care for it. This also reminds me of Peter's university thesis, which he wrote when we were back at university. So Peter, my partner, he named his thesis "Project Environmental Imagination." His thesis that he wrote at university. And he was arguing in his thesis that it's useless designing the most energy efficient and environmentally friendly buildings if ultimately people don't like them, and won't want to inhabit them. So make buildings beautiful, combine beauty with environmental requirements, and you get sustainable and long-lasting buildings. And beauty, I think, is something which we sometimes need to be reminded of as well. William Dodge was previously on your show, but he's come to Malta quite a few times, and he knows how we are. We're quite hot-blooded, Mediterranean. We're always complaining, and he tells us, "You guys just have beauty fatigue. You guys have beauty fatigue. You're just always looking at beautiful things." And when he does say that, he's right. He reminds me of how beautiful our surroundings really are. For example, I live and work here in Valletta, so my apartment is about not even a kilometer away from our office. So I like to walk to work. And before I come to work in the morning, I take my dog out for a walk, and then I go for a jog around the periphery of Valletta. Valletta is a peninsula, right, which is flanked by two harbors, and it's surrounded by these amazing fortifications, which are just rising out of the rock and out of the sea, and they look like these organic and natural kind of formations which are just coming out of the ground. And on my run, I just look around me and look at the fortifications, at the sea, at the geometry, at the sun, at the light and shade, and all this chiaroscuro. And I just always think like, wow, it's so beautiful just being here. And I end my jog with a jump into the sea. So I jump into the Mediterranean Sea, and I turn around and just look at the fortifications, and then I go to work.
I think everybody listening hates you now.
Yeah. What more of a beautiful way to start the day. I've now made it a point. Like I do this 5 times a week and I wouldn't change it for anything.
So going back to architecture, when you again talking about beauty and your work, which has such a distinct architectural language, like the clear lines, the playful colors, and really good quality work. How do you decide what old elements stays and what becomes modernized?
I think it really depends on the case. We try to we try to figure out which parts of a building have value and which don't. Sometimes, I mean, there's also a lot of decay in these types of buildings, you know. So, in fact, I went to see this house yesterday with a colleague of mine, which is a new project. Hopefully, we'll be working on. And even in terms of the building structure, you know, sometimes the building will be so decayed and sometimes not very well built that you'd have to dismantle parts of it. But this dismantling also gives you an opportunity to create something new and in contrast with the old parts of the building, like placing a very well designed new and contemporary extension to an old building makes these two parts of the building look really amazing, you know, and creates a really interesting relationship between the two. Recently as well, a few weeks ago, I went to visit a project which two architect friends of mine are working on here in Malta, Anthony and Carl. And they designed a new part of a house and placed it beneath this old British barrack. So, in a way that when you experience the building and walk through it, you start to question. Obviously, it was intentional. You start to question which part of the building came first. So they built this really beautifully done new extension out of reinforced concrete and placed it beneath this British barrack. They kind of raised this barrack on stilts and built beneath it. So they created this incredible contrast, which was really really interesting to experience, and I'm really excited to see the building when it's ready. And so people might argue, yes, but you know, it's built in concrete. You know, concrete is not a very sustainable material. True. You know, there is truth to that. But if this building is going to be there for a long time, then it can also be sustainable. You know what I mean?
Also, talking about building materials, Malta is an island. Do you have, besides of stone, materials on site, or do you import everything?
A lot of material here is imported, but there are also, when it comes to materials like concrete, you know, there are concrete plants here in Malta which produce blocks and stuff like this. But a lot of material like timber and stuff like this is imported, and a lot of other building materials are imported too. In terms of natural resources, it's only stone which is available here. In fact, my father works in an old family business which import timber. They've been selling timber, I think, for over 100 years. And when I was young, both me and my sister, who was also an architect and who also used to work together, we used to spend our Saturday mornings with my dad and his brother Peter at their warehouses, you know, surrounded by these 4-5 meter high planks of like solid American walnut, oak, mahogany, and the smell of timber still stayed with me. So I went a bit off track here, but mentioning these things made me think of that. Maybe that's also one of the reasons why I decided to pursue a career in architecture.
That's such a beautiful ending, like well around. I do have one last question for you. If someone listening is working on their own home right now, or even just thinking about what kind of architecture they value, what is one mindset shift you would love for them to walk away with after hearing this conversation?
So architecture and design doesn't always have to shout. Sometimes it needs to listen. So even in terms of what we do to our buildings, a lot of people I think approach building and designing a house is something which a lot of people have been thinking of for most of their lives. Finally, it's my time to build and design my house or to renovate this house. So it's many times it's one of the biggest investments someone would also do, in their lives because renovating and building houses costs a lot of money. So they put a lot of thought into it, and my advice would be try to forget about preconceived ideas which you might have in your head, so things which maybe you think you want, and always try to explore things which maybe you'd expect less. So even for us as architects, it's not always easy to convince our clients to do certain things. There's always a trust relationship which we need to build with them before they can trust us to do certain things because people always have a lot of preconceived ideas, which is understandable. They've got their family telling them how to do things, their friends are also telling them how to do things. But I think it's important for them to always listen to their architect.
That is one that I really much encourage. No, I mean, everybody has lived in a home. You would never tell your doctor what to do because you have never done surgery on a knee, but you have lived in a home, in a house, so you know what you like and what you don't.
Yes.
Sandro, this has been super interesting. Thank you so much for all the stories. I'm really looking forward to traveling to Malta sometime.
Sure.
If our listeners want to follow your work and see what you do, where can they find you?
We're on Instagram, Valentino Architects, and they can also check out our website, which is valentinoarchitects.com.
Perfect. I will link that in the description of the episode.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ladina. It's been a pleasure.
A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials at @LadinaShipf. Thanks.